Hi, my name is Jeanette and I want to thank you for joining me today. So today I thought I would talk about my favorite historical authors. I've done videos on my favorite romantic suspense authors and my favorite contemporary romance authors. So I thought let's share my favorite historical authors. Now I don't have very many historical authors that I've read multiple books of. Historical is kind of a really hit and miss for me. That I've read quite a few, but nobody that, or shouldn't say nobody, very few that I've read multiples of, or that are ones that as soon as I pick up and finish a book, I want to read another book in that genre by that author. So I have three historical authors to talk about where I've read more than one book, and one of them I've only read two historical fiction books by her, but I'm keeping an eye out for more by her, so I'm including her. And then I'm also going to include an author who does dual timeline fiction that I think she does it really well and I really enjoy. So I have four authors to talk about. So the first author is kind of the first one that really got me hooked on, well, hooked on historical fiction, or has kept me hooked on historical fiction. So that is Karen Witemeyer. The first book I read by her was Heart on the Line. I read this in 2017 and I loved it. I did not realize when I'd read it, it was book 2 of a series and I had not read book 1. But I read it first. I read book 2 first. And I didn't feel like I was lost. I felt like I really kind of knew what was going on, what the setting was. So I have since read book 1. I think I did not read it like immediately after. I think it was probably a good couple years until I actually read book 1 of the series. But book 2 just drew me in so much. It was called Heart on the Line, and it features Grace and Amos. So Grace lives in a town of Harper Station that is made up of primarily women. In fact, there's only one man that lives in town. She is a telegraph operator and forms a friendship with another telegraph operator in another town, Amos. Amos is not your typical hero type guy leading man that you see in a lot of books. He's not tall, strong, doesn't see himself as tall, strong. He's not a lawman. He is a telegraph operator. So he's just your average guy. He would classify himself as somewhat nerdy, probably. As soon as he hears that Grace is in trouble, he comes running to town to help her and be her hero. Now, he is the second man that arrives in town. The ladies don't like that. What is going on? Their town is being invaded by men all of a sudden. No, not by just two. There's a few others that are coming to town. And I loved this story. I loved that Amos wasn't your typical hero, but wasn't the typical hero that you see in books, but comes across as a hero and is a hero to Grace. As soon as I finished this book, I had to find more stories by Karen. I was so thrown in. I loved the writing style. Since reading that book, I have now read 12 books by her, and I have reread at least 2 or maybe 3 of those 12 books. My other favorite, that if you're only ever going to read 2 books by Karen, these are the 2 I would say you need to read first. Heart on the Line, obviously. It was the one that drew me into her writing. The second one is More Than Words Can Say. This is also book 2 of another series called The Patchwork Family. Abigail runs a bakery, and it is threatened by the city council because she's not married. She needs a man's name on the lease. historical times. So in order to keep the bakery, she comes up with a plan, and it turns into a marriage of convenience story, and it seems to be the only solution. Now, as happens in marriage of convenience books, the two characters get together to get the man's name on the title of the bakery, and she gets to keep her bakery. But what happens after? How do things develop? As I've said before, I love marriage and convenience stories. So again, obviously, I really enjoyed this book. So these are the two I would recommend that you read by Karen. So then the next author I'm going to mention is Carrie Turansky. Now, I mean, it should be no shock if you've watched any of my other videos that I absolutely loved this book, No Ocean Too Wide. This was the book that introduced me to Carrie Turansky. I read this first in 2019, and I read it again just a few months ago. April, maybe? I think. I'll have to look. It was either March or April. And so I have only read two of her historical books, No Ocean and No Journey, which is the sequel to No Ocean. I do have another book, a historical fiction book, on my wish list by her, and that is Across the Blue. So it's on my wish list. I'm kind of keeping an eye out for it to see. I have read a couple other books. She also writes contemporary. So I have read a couple of her contemporary ones, and while I enjoyed them, it's definitely the historicals that have captured me. And I'm definitely I follow her on Goodreads now, I follow her on Amazon, I follow her website, get her newsletter, because I want to know when she comes out with a new historical fiction book. So I'm not really going to talk about this book because I've talked about it a couple times, so I will link the videos below where I've talked about it. And No Journey Too Far, because I read these two back to back, just as I said, in the last few months. So then the next author is Shanna Hatfield. So Shanna writes historical and contemporary romance. I really enjoy both of her genres. It doesn't matter which one, I will pick it up and read it. For historical romance, the one that introduced me to her writing, and I think this was the book that introduced me to her writing, period. Didn't matter the genre, I think this is the one that introduced me to her. So, I mean, that's probably why it holds a special place. It is called The Christmas Bargain, and I read this in 2015 for the first time. I have since read it 3 times. So I've read it 2 more times since, so I've read it a total of 3 times. I talked about it in my shelf spotlight of the wedding dress covers in June. So I will link that video below where I go into a little bit more of it. Again, it's another marriage convenience story. So since reading that book, I have read 34 of her historical setting books. As I said, she writes both historical and contemporary. So, and I talked about her in my contemporary romance video that I did last month. So I will also link that below. And I've read 28 books in that genre. So I've read quite a few Shanna Hatfield books, and I love majority of them. There's a few that just I don't really connect with as much, but majority of them I really love. And so, as I mentioned, The Christmas Bargain is totally my favorite book by her. Then, other books that I've really enjoyed is Garden of Her Heart, which is book 1 of her Hearts of War series. And a soldier is returning from, I want to say, the Vietnam War, and ends up at this farm, and this woman, Japanese woman, it's been a while since I read this book, this Japanese woman helps him kind of recover from the injuries, and the two end up falling in love, and just the way the love develops and just the romance throughout this book, I loved it. Then another book that I've really enjoyed by her is called Aundy. It is book number 1 of the Pendleton Petticoats. Pendleton. So it is a mail order bride story. So Aundy arrives in town as a mail order bride. On the day of her wedding, the day she arrives in town, her now husband gets killed. And so, I mean, like, they've been together a couple hours, maybe, at this point in time. And so now she has inherited this farm, doesn't know anything about, she came from the city, doesn't know anything about farm life, but she is determined to stick it out. And with the help of the neighboring farm, she ends up developing the farm, and it's a success. And a romance develops between one of the neighbors, and it's just, again, it's one, and it introduces you to this town and the characters. I think there's 9 or 10 books in this series, and each book focuses on a different character around the town. So characters from the previous books are involved, and it's such a community that I've read this book twice, and I think I've read probably at least books 1 to 5 twice, because again, as a new book gets introduced, I like to go back and kind of refresh my memory of the characters and what's happened up to this point. It's another one I would highly recommend reading. So then the last author I'm going to mention is the one that writes Dual Timeline, and she does write strictly contemporary romance as well, but I prefer her Dual Timeline stories, and that is Rachel Hauck. So I was introduced to her writing through the book The Wedding Dress in 2014, and so it was my first time reading that book. I have since reread that book just recently, so it was in my June wrap-up. It might be in my May wrap-up, because I think The Wedding Dress I finished in May, and I finished The Wedding Chapel in June, I think. I will link those videos down below so you can see. But since then, since first reading her book in 2014, I have read 17 books by her. As I said, she writes both dual timeline and contemporary. I enjoy some of her contemporary stories, but I really love her dual timeline stories so much better. So my favorites by her are The Wedding Chapel. Now, I know I read this one in June, and I talked about it in my June wrap-up, so as I mentioned, I will link that below. I loved that story, and just kind of learning the history of the chapel, learning the characters that kind of made that story up, come together, it's just such a heartwarming love story between multiple characters. So the other book that kind of sticks out to me is The Writing Desk. Now, this is a story that features 2 women writers, one in a historical timeline and one in a contemporary timeline. One is being forced to marry, and the other is dealing with writer's block. I had no idea how this story was going to connect these 2 characters together and connect the timelines. But as it progressed, I began caring more and more about each character and what was going to happen. And I fell in love with the men as they were introduced in this book. I had to keep reading to find out what was going to happen. That's really all I'm going to say about the book, because I don't remember a ton of it. I just know that I really enjoyed this story. And again, I really enjoyed the historical setting was the one that I really, really cared about. Now, I enjoyed the contemporary people, but they didn't capture me as much as the historical 2 characters. And kind of the whole storyline about the being forced to marry. Two other books that stick out in my mind by Rachel Hauck are The Memory House and The Love Letter. I rated both of these ones 4 stars. I don't remember a ton about them. I know The Memory House, the historical setting, talks about a tornado in Waco, Texas. And in the contemporary setting, somebody inherits a house down, I don't think it's in Texas, but kind of, I think like New Orleans area maybe, kind of southern states. I don't remember a ton about it. It's been a few years since I read it. I just know that I enjoyed these stories and I rated them 4 stars. So basically, my recommendation for Rachel Hauck is read her dual timeline stories, particularly The Wedding Chapel and The Writing Desk. Now, I do have other historical authors. I have other historical fiction books on my TBR by authors I've never read from before. So I'm hoping to find kind of a few more authors because it's a genre I've really enjoyed, but I find very limited to the ones that I want to pick up more by. So if you have any recommendations for me, kind of let me know what your favorite historical fiction book is, or even who the author is. And I want to add to my TBR. Why not? Can never have too many books. So thank you for joining me today. Thank you for taking the time to watch this, and I look forward to chatting in the comments below. Have a good day. Bye.